My fiance made me sign a prenup, then I found out he was cheating. So I left him with nothing. There was a time when I thought I had won the life lottery. You know those romance movies where the charming, successful guy sweeps the woman off her feet and into a world of luxury, passion, and endless devotion? That was my life. At least, that's what I believed. For 3 years, I lived in what felt like a fairy tale. And the leading man? Ethan, 32M. Ethan wasn't just any guy. He was the guy. The kind of man that women dreamed about and men secretly envied. He had it all. Piercing blue eyes, a chiseled jawline, an effortless confidence that made everyone gravitate towards him. And money. More money than I'd ever seen up close in my life. We met at a business conference of all places. I remember walking in, feeling a little out of place in my modest navy blue dress, while everyone else looked like they had just stepped off the cover of Forbes. Ethan was one of the keynote speakers, and while I had no idea who he was at the time, I remember how the room hung onto his every word. When the session ended, I wandered over to the bar, trying to blend in while I sipped my overpriced cocktail. And that's when I heard his voice behind me. "Did you find the presentation useful?" I turned around, and there he was. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Not in an "I'm better than you" way, but in the "I could sell her to a drowning man" way. His confidence wasn't loud. It was smooth, controlled, dangerous. The kind of charm that could unravel you if you weren't careful. I played it cool, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. "It was interesting," I said, raising my glass. "Although I have some doubts about your take on market trends." His lips curled into a smile. "Oh, a skeptic. I like that." And just like that, we were talking. Really talking. A 15-minute networking break turned into an hour-long conversation. Then dinner. Then another dinner. Before I knew it, he was flying me out to meet him on his business trips, introducing me to high-profile people like it was nothing. Ethan made me feel special, like I belonged in his world. He wasn't just generous with his money. He was generous with his time. Every moment with him was an experience. He made simple things extravagant. Brunch wasn't just brunch. It was a rooftop meal overlooking the city. Date night wasn't a casual dinner. It was a last-minute trip to Paris for the weekend. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living, really living. And when he proposed, it was straight out of a dream. We were in Santorini, standing on the balcony of a private villa. The sky was painted in hues of gold and pink. The ocean stretched endlessly before us. Ethan got down on one knee, pulled out a diamond ring that could have paid off my student loans 10 times over, and said the words that made my head spin. "Marry me." I barely let him finish before I said yes. Because why wouldn't I? Ethan was perfect. Our life together was perfect. At least, that's what I thought. I didn't realize that the fairy tale I was living in, it wasn't real. And I was about to wake up in the worst possible way. The first time Ethan mentioned a prenup, I brushed it off. We were in the middle of a wedding planning session, seated in his sleek penthouse overlooking the city. A wedding planner sat between us, discussing venues and floral arrangements, while I flipped through a catalog of designer wedding dresses. It was supposed to be an exciting moment, the kind where couples bask in the thrill of planning their perfect day. Instead, Ethan casually slid a thick stack of papers across the marble countertop. The document was crisp, freshly printed, with a polished, no-nonsense weight to it. The kind of thing that felt more at home in a high-stakes corporate deal than between two people planning to spend their lives together. He smiled at me like it was no big deal. Said it was just a formality, nothing personal. Just smart business. At that moment, I told myself that this was normal. Rich men protect their assets, right? It didn't mean he didn't love me. It didn't mean he didn't trust me. I was independent, successful in my own right. I had a career, savings, and I wasn't some gold digger looking for a free ride. So, I convinced myself that signing the prenup was the mature thing to do. That if I refused, I'd look shallow, greedy, or worse, like I was marrying him for his money. Ethan reassured me that it was a safety net, a simple precaution that would protect us both. He made it sound so logical, so reasonable, that I felt silly for even hesitating. So I signed. I should have asked more questions. I should have read between the lines. Because after that, things started changing. Ethan became more secretive. His phone, once left carelessly on counters and tables, was suddenly glued to his side. He stopped sharing details about his day like he used to. Business trips started popping up more frequently, always last minute, always vague. When I asked him about it, he reassured me that his workload had increased, that the expansion of his company required more of his time. And I believed him, because why wouldn't I? But the little things, the tiny cracks in the perfect facade, began adding up. He became colder, more distant, as if the man who had once worshipped the ground I walked on had suddenly grown tired of me. Conversations that used to be filled with laughter and shared dreams turned into clipped, distracted exchanges. When I reached for him at night, he was already turned away, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. At first, I told myself it was just wedding stress, that things would go back to normal once we were officially married, that every couple went through phases like this. But then, there were the other signs. Late nights at the office that stretched into early mornings. A sudden shift in his cologne, one I had never smelled on him before. The way he started dressing sharper, more deliberately, even on days he wasn't supposed to be seeing clients. There were moments, brief but sharp, where I felt like I was watching a stranger move through our life, wearing Ethan's face but lacking any of the warmth he once had. Then came the poker night. It was just another one of his routine get-togethers with his friends, the kind of night where expensive whiskey flowed freely and laughter bounced off the walls of our home. I had been upstairs, brushing my hair in front of the vanity, when the conversation from below drifted up to me. The laughter was loud, unrestrained. The sound of clinking glasses punctuated the air. And then I heard it. Ethan's voice, confident, arrogant, laughing as he told his friends how the prenup was the best decision he had ever made. How it ensured that if I ever tried to leave, I would walk away with nothing. How he had framed it as protecting us both, but, in reality, had done it to keep himself in control. How, if he ever got bored, he could move on without losing a cent. The casual cruelty in his voice made my stomach drop. I sat frozen in front of the mirror, the brush clutched tightly in my hand as realization washed over me. He had never planned for forever. He had planned for convenience. For the first time in 3 years, I saw Ethan not as the man who had swept me into a whirlwind romance, but as the kind of man who built his entire life on calculated moves. And I was just another move. But I wasn't going to be a pawn in his game. Not anymore. I didn't storm downstairs. I didn't confront him right then and there. Instead, I stayed still, forcing my face to remain neutral when he finally came up later that night, smelling of whiskey and victory. I let him kiss me, let him fall asleep beside me, as if nothing had changed, because he thought he had already won. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. I barely slept that night. I lay beside Ethan, staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and cold, calculating clarity. His words kept echoing in my head, looping like a cruel joke. He had played me. Every loving gesture, every carefully crafted moment. It had all been leading to this, a setup, so that when he eventually discarded me, I would be left with nothing. I had spent 3 years thinking I had found my soulmate. But the man lying beside me wasn't my partner. He was my opponent. I didn't cry. Crying was useless now. I was past that. By the time morning arrived, I had a plan forming in my head. I just needed one thing, leverage, because walking away wasn't enough. Not anymore. I wanted to make him regret ever underestimating me. That day, I went through the motions as if nothing had changed. I kissed him goodbye as he left for work, plastered on a warm smile as I wished him a productive day. And as soon as he was out the door, I got to work. The first step was finding proof, because the prenup was ironclad. Unless, of course, he had broken the one clause that could bring it all crashing down. Infidelity. Ethan was arrogant. That much was clear from the way he had spoken about me, like I was nothing more than an accessory. And arrogant men made mistakes. They got careless. I started with his laptop. He rarely logged out of his accounts, and I knew his password. It was a variation of his company name and birthday. Something so predictable, it was almost insulting. The evidence I needed. Emails, long, flirtatious exchanges with someone named B. I scrolled, scanning through weeks, months of correspondence. Messages filled with inside jokes, shared secrets, and late-night rendezvous disguised as business meetings. There were attachments too, hotel receipts, confirmations for expensive jewelry purchases, gifts that had never made their way to me. The rage I felt wasn't just because he had cheated. It was because he had done it with such casual indifference, as if I wasn't even worth the effort of covering his tracks properly. I kept going, my hands moving faster now, driven by adrenaline. His Uber history confirmed it. Multiple trips to a luxury hotel downtown, all coinciding with nights he had told me he was out of town. His texts were worse. Explicit messages exchanged late at night. Plans for their next meetup. Her asking if I suspected anything. Him replying, laughing, saying I was too naive to ever figure it out. I wanted to throw his laptop across the room, smash it into a million pieces. But I didn't, because this wasn't about anger anymore. It was about revenge. I forwarded everything to myself. Emails, receipts, texts. Every single damning piece of evidence. Then I found it. The prenup. I pulled up the document, scrolling through the legal jargon until I found what I was looking for. The infidelity clause. If Ethan was caught cheating, the prenup would be rendered void, and I would be entitled to half of everything. And he had put it there, probably assuming I'd never catch him. I nearly laughed at the irony. He had been so certain that he had backed me into a corner. So smug, so sure that I was just another woman who would go along with whatever he decided. He had no idea that I was about to ruin him. I spent the next week pretending. I smiled. I kissed him goodnight. I let him believe everything was normal. Because what fun was revenge if he saw it coming? For the first time in 3 years, I saw Ethan for who he truly was, a man who had never loved me. A man who had calculated every step of our relationship to ensure that he would always come out on top. But what he didn't realize was that I had spent years watching him, studying him, learning exactly how he operated. He believed he was untouchable. That made him sloppy. And sloppy men always leave a trail. I wasn't just going to leave him. I was going to destroy him. The week after I uncovered his affair, I played my role to perfection. Every morning, I kissed him goodbye at the door like the devoted fiancé he thought I was. I asked about his day, laughed at his jokes, and even let him believe I was too distracted with last-minute wedding details to notice that he was still sneaking around. But behind the scenes, I was collecting everything I needed. I copied every receipt, every message, every hotel confirmation. I recorded phone calls where he fed me lies about where he was. I even took photos of his packed suitcase when he claimed he was traveling for work, only to find the same bag still in our closet the next morning. I became a ghost in my own home, moving unnoticed, blending into the background as I watched him unravel his own life without even realizing it. And then I found her, the other woman. Buried in his text was a name, Bianca. She was younger, early 20s, probably an assistant or some low-level employee at his company. The kind of woman who saw Ethan as a golden ticket, a stepping stone to a more comfortable life. I dug into her social media. It wasn't hard. She wasn't exactly careful. Pictures of expensive dinners, vacations, and gifts, none of which she could afford on her salary, were scattered across her Instagram. A particular bracelet caught my attention. Ethan had told me he had a business dinner that night, and yet, there it was, sparkling on her wrist in a dimly lit restaurant I recognized because Ethan had taken me there once too. That was all the confirmation I needed. I could have confronted him right then, screamed, thrown things, let my rage consume me. But I knew Ethan. He would lie, manipulate, twist my words until somehow I was the villain for spying on him. So I waited. 2 nights before the wedding, I booked a spa day for myself. I played the part of the blissful bride-to-be, telling Ethan I wanted to relax before a big day. He smiled, kissed me on the forehead, and told me I deserved it. Then, the moment I left, he booked a hotel room. His mistake? Using our shared credit card. By the time I arrived at the spa, I had already received the transaction alert. I didn't even have to check. I knew who he was with. I could have called him. I could have texted Bianca, let her know exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't satisfying. No, I needed this to hurt. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I called my lawyer. He was efficient. By the time I walked out of the spa, fresh-faced and glowing, my lawyer had already prepared the divorce papers. Predated, of course, because once infidelity was proven, the prenup would be void. Half of everything Ethan owned was about to be mine, and he wouldn't know it until it was too late. The morning of the wedding, I woke up feeling serene. There was no trace of anxiety, no second-guessing, no last-minute nerves. The decision had already been made, and in a few short hours, Ethan would finally learn the cost of underestimating me. I went through the motions effortlessly, allowing everyone around me to believe I was just another excited bride. My bridesmaids gushed over my dress, my hair, the picturesque venue Ethan had paid an obscene amount of money for. I played the role of the blissful fiancé perfectly, smiling, laughing, pretending I hadn't spent the last 2 weeks plotting the complete annihilation of the man waiting for me at the altar. Meanwhile, Ethan was oblivious, completely unaware that as he stood at the front of that extravagant ceremony, with his perfectly tailored tuxedo and that smug little smile, thinking he had already won, his entire world was on the verge of collapse. Because today wasn't just a wedding. It was the day I buried him. The ceremony was beautiful. Too beautiful. White roses, crystal chandeliers, and a string quartet playing soft classical music as I walked down the aisle. Every detail meticulously designed to create the illusion of a perfect fairy tale. And Ethan? He was glowing, standing there with all his arrogance and self-importance, believing he had secured the perfect future, the devoted, loyal wife who would never leave, who had already signed away her rights to anything he owned. But as I reached him, looking up into those deceitful blue eyes, I felt nothing. No love, no heartbreak, just the sweet, simmering satisfaction of knowing that in a matter of hours, he would be left with absolutely nothing. The vows came and went in a blur. I barely heard his promises of love and fidelity, the words that meant absolutely nothing coming from a man who had betrayed them long before he even spoke them. And when it was my turn, I smiled, took his hands in mine, and said the words that sealed our fate. Ido. By the time we made it to the reception, Ethan was practically vibrating with triumph. He had no idea that as we stood together for the first dance, as our guests toasted to our happiness, my lawyer was already working behind the scenes to ensure his downfall. That night, when the party was over and the last guest had left, we retreated to our lavish honeymoon suite. One last illusion of perfection before I shattered it completely. Ethan pulled me close, whispering about our future, about how he couldn't wait to start this new chapter. I let him talk, let him believe, just for a little longer, that he was still in control. Then, while he lay beside me, sleeping peacefully, I reached for my phone, and I sent everything, every piece of evidence, to my lawyer. The next morning, I woke up early. Ethan was still sprawled across the luxurious hotel bed, breathing evenly, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. But he had no idea what was coming. I slipped out of bed, crossing the suite in silence, the weight of anticipation settling over me like a second skin. Everything was already in motion. The papers had been filed, the evidence submitted, and now all I had to do was watch. A sharp knock at the door broke the morning stillness. Ethan stirred beside me, groaning, rubbing a hand over his face as he slowly woke. He muttered something about room service and lazily pulled on his robe before making his way to the door. I stood near the window, watching. When he opened it, the hotel staff stepped aside, revealing my lawyer. Without hesitation, the man handed Ethan a thick envelope, the divorce papers. Ethan frowned, still groggy, and took the documents, flipping through them with increasing urgency. His grip tightened, his face shifting from confusion to disbelief as he skimmed the contents. The silence in the room stretched unbearably. Then, finally realization hit. He turned to me, demanding an explanation, his voice sharp, laced with something between anger and panic. I met his gaze, calm and collected, and told him the truth. That I had found everything. That this moment, this exact moment, had been inevitable from the second he betrayed me. I watched as he sputtered out excuses, weak attempts to justify the unjustifiable. He reached for me, desperation creeping into his expression. But I took a step back. There was nothing left to discuss. I grabbed my suitcase, turned, and walked out, leaving him standing there, holding the papers that sealed his fate. I walked out of the hotel room, my heels clicking against the marble floors, my heart pounding, but not with fear, with satisfaction, with freedom. Ethan was still inside, frozen, staring at the divorce papers in disbelief. I imagined him standing there, gripping the documents like they were some sort of mistake, as if rereading them would change the words printed in black and white. But there was no mistake. I took the elevator down, stepped outside into the crisp morning air, and slid into the waiting car. My lawyer had arranged everything. My bags were packed, my legal team was already preparing for the next phase, and by the time Ethan fully realized what had happened, I would be halfway across the city, sipping coffee and finalizing the real battle, the court proceedings. Because while leaving him that morning had been satisfying, the real reckoning was about to begin. Ethan tried to fight it. Of course he did. For a man so obsessed with control, there was no way he was going to just accept that I had outmaneuvered him. He hired an expensive legal team, tried to argue that the infidelity clause in the prenup wasn't enough to overturn the agreement. He claimed the texts, the receipts, the Uber logs, everything I'd gathered was circumstantial. He even tried to say I had violated his privacy by digging through his things, as if that would somehow make a judge ignore the fact that he had blatantly broken the very contract he had put in place. But here's the thing about courts. They don't care about his feelings. They care about evidence. And I had more than enough. My lawyer laid it all out. The emails, the hotel stays, the recorded conversations where he had admitted to his friends, his own friends, that he had structured the prenup to trap me in a powerless position. The smug, arrogant way he had laughed about how I would walk away with nothing. I didn't have to say much. I simply sat there calm, collected, while my lawyer did what they did best. When the judge ruled in my favor, Ethan's face went pale. Half of his assets, half of the money he had spent years hoarding, half of the real estate, including his penthouse, the one he had smugly assumed I would never be entitled to. And because I was feeling particularly generous, I didn't even want the penthouse. I requested that it be sold, because I wanted Ethan to watch as the home he had built, the empire he had tried to shield from me, was stripped away piece by piece. The final nail in his coffin? The court documents were public. Everyone, his colleagues, his clients, his business partners, would know the truth. That Ethan Carter, the wealthy, untouchable businessman, had not only lost half his fortune, but had lost it because he couldn't keep it in his pants. By the time we walked out of that courtroom, I knew Ethan would never recover from this, and I had never felt lighter. Winning in court was just the beginning. I thought walking out of that courtroom, with my settlement secured and Ethan sitting there in stunned silence, would be the most satisfying moment of all. But what happened after? That was when everything truly unraveled for him. The first blow came fast. Ethan's business reputation had always been built on control, on the image of a man who never made mistakes. A man who was always 2 steps ahead. He had spent years cultivating this illusion that he was untouchable, calculated, and in complete control of everything around him. And yet, suddenly, everyone knew the truth. Because the second those court documents became public record, the whispers started. His business partners, the same people he had always impressed with his charisma, started looking at him differently. Investors don't like recklessness, and Ethan? He had been exposed. Ethan tried to do damage control. He put out statements. He tried to paint himself as the victim, claimed I had set him up and manipulated the system. But the problem? He had built his entire brand on being smarter than everyone else. And now, the entire world could see that he wasn't. The second blow hit even harder. Because his family? Oh, they were furious. His father had always been a man of old-school values. He wasn't moral. Let's not get that twisted. But he believed in appearances. And Ethan? Ethan had humiliated him. And Bianca? The side piece he had risked everything for? She left the moment the money dried up. Because she hadn't been in love with Ethan. She had been in love with the lifestyle. The fancy trips, the designer gifts, the promise of security. He was broke. Oh, not completely. He still had some money left. But compared to the empire he had once controlled, he was just another rich guy who had lost everything. I moved out of the city, started my own business, built a life that was truly mine, one that no man could ever control again. Months later, Ethan tried to reach out. He called, texted, sent long-winded emails about how he had learned from his mistakes, how he missed me, how we could start over. I didn't reply. I let him sit in the wreckage of his own making. Because the truth is, he had never been in love with me. He had been in love with control, and now he had none.